Birds fly, Houston is back in the saddle, and we have the first ever hero pools in the Overwatch League. All that and more this week on The Control Point.
A big thank you to Skillshare for supporting our content. Elohel Esports wants to help people gain skills that will lead them to become esports professionals, and Skillshare lets you do just that. With Skillshare, you can learn and develop your skills on a wide range of fields and topics. Visit the link below to sign up for a free trial today.
Welcome everybody to week 2 episode, technically week 5 or 4 episode 2 of The Control Point. I'm Paulsible. With me is Kenobi and Lafon. This week, we're going to talk about the hero pool lottery that happened during the Watchpoint post show Sunday night. After that, we'll review all of the matches from this past weekend in Houston, and then we'll preview the return to Washington. But first, Kenobi, let's talk about how this hero bingo really went, because it wasn't how we necessarily expected it to.
Right, and I actually really like the idea of how they did the quote-unquote hero bingo. They did it very much like an ye olde bingo style, right? They put him in the cage, and then they turned the crank, and then there were some cards in there, and you just pulled one out, and that was the hero that was banned. And I really liked that idea of how they did it that way. It's fun. It had some showmanship that I really liked as well. So I think that's a really nice way of doing it. But unfortunately, Lafon might not be having that in the future.
Yeah, no, it's likely, in fact, actually said by Uber on stream himself that this was the first and only time it's going to happen this way, at least as of Sunday night. It's going to go internal to Blizzard here on out. So definitely that show aspect of it going to be removed just a little bit. And I think, honestly, a little bit at the worst, because it was entertaining, to say the least.
Well, it was certainly entertaining, but how do we feel about the actual process behind it? We don't necessarily know how the devs will choose hero bans in the future, but for this time, at the very least, all heroes who had 10% or more playtime had an equal chance to one another to being removed for this first week of the hero pools. That means we saw characters like May that had well over 80% playtime have the same chance as being removed as Widowmaker or Doomfist, who barely eked past that 10% margin.
It sucks. It really does.
Yeah.
It should have been a weighted lottery in my mind, and I think that's one thing that needs to be changed if they're going to go with the more, random aspect of it. It should be a weighted lottery.
Especially, for example, if we have teams like, for instance, Chengdu, they come out, right? They're probably going to get to a point where Hammond, if they've been playing anything like last year, Hammond's going to be at a 10%. And then if you remove Hammond at that point and no one else is playing it, then you've kind of just said, screw you, Chengdu, you're screwed. You don't get to play that hero anymore. So they need to really, I think Lafon's right, weighted lottery is the way to go.
All right, well, let's move on to our review of the first Houston homestand. And I think we have to start with the home team here, because we get a little bit of a less sad yeehaw. Houston, they went 1-1. They picked up their first win in the 2020 season, Kenobi.
And they did it by they learned the value of the hack fist, right? With a player like Dante on their team, a player like Blase, who, by the way, just aside, Blase, incredibly talented on Doomfist, and they've been playing the heroes that they're more comfortable to them, right? When they play this hack fist composition, no one can stop them. I think it's the best composition at all that we've seen from them. So putting Dante and Blase on their carry potential heroes, that's the way to go, I think, for Houston going forward. Definitely map dependent, but they have a formula now on how to win.
Well, and they weren't the only DPS heroes to come out this week for Houston that we were happy to see, were they, Lafon?
No, Linkser was back in play, not necessarily as effective as, Dante and Blase perhaps, but I think it is something to be said for Houston that they're starting to play their roster in their proper roles, strengths to strengths. And I think that's where Houston needs to be if they want to be somewhere at the end of the season, right? We're not talking about, just showing up at your homestand and going 1-1. We're talking about perhaps making playoffs. You need to have that consistent roster. And I think there's two things that come to mind. A, Linkser being played, and two, the fact that there's no flex support carousel that kind of happened in our previous games with Houston.
Just to touch a little bit.
We're all glad about that.
Yeah, and just to touch a little bit on Linkser and how he played kind of as opposed to Blase on the McCree specifically, like Linkser has those moments where he can clutch out team fights by himself, right? He's always been a player who's had those clutch moments, whereas Blase haven't really seen that from him as McCree. It's been serviceable at best at times, but he doesn't have moments like Linkser where he can just like carry fights, right? Just like come out, get 3 dinks, win a fight for Houston. Blase didn't have that. So now that Linkser is there and has that potential as well, that's also a good sign for Houston.
Well, not so good signs for Houston. As true, they did get their first win this weekend. Good for them against the Toronto Defiant, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're in perfect form, Kenobi.
There are still some cracks on that team. Muma is, I think, the example right now that I would look to in terms of just being a weak spot on this team. On his Reinhardt, his Winston, we can talk about that, get into that a little bit later, maybe in the post show, but his Reinhardt specifically, which is the meta main tank right now for a bit, but his Reinhardt did not look good at all. He made J-Mac look like player of the match, actually got player of the match, which is definitely, that's not the bar you want to be setting, right? So Muma needs to look a little bit better on that Reinhardt specifically.
Sure, but let's double back a bit, Lafon, because I briefly brought up the Toronto Defiant. Let's hone in on them as a team, because I feel like the more they play, the less sure I am what is going on up in Canada, right? Because they come out last week and they have a beautiful 5-match set against Philly Fusion. Everyone's like, oh, Toronto is punching above their expected weight class. And then this week, not only do they get slapped by the Atlanta Reign when we thought that might have been a close match, but they give Houston an undeniably bottom of the league team their first ever win.
I mean, you can't see it from where I'm currently sitting, but this hat is a Toronto Defiant hat. So
is that why it's backwards? Is this a moment of respect for your fallen homies in Canada?
I didn't want to say it, but I think here the biggest thing that comes to mind is Surefour, or the lack thereof at times. Yes, he wasn't in during the one map. You know, it was Logix who was in that map that Toronto won against Houston. But overall, in the season that we've had so far, in season 3, Surefour has been the most consistent DPS on that Toronto roster. And I think here, Toronto Defiant need to stop playing roster chess, and it's, you know, less roster chess and more like roster tic-tac-toe, because it is super predictable. It's looking awfully, you know, vulnerable at times, especially to lower ranked teams. And no shade to Houston, they are not a good roster, at least not this early in the season. So I think here for Toronto Defiant, there's more questions about how they're approaching their gameplay, how they're approaching their coaching, and how they're approaching their roster than anything in game, because I think individually the pieces are all there. The execution certainly isn't.
And what other pieces can we look at, Kenobi, when it comes to Toronto with a bit more of a smile on our face? We talked about Surefour. Obviously, I got a Gladiators jersey in my bag specifically for Surefour. So I love that DPS player. Right. But is there other places in this roster where we can look for glimmers of hope?
I mean, you would say someone like Agilities, but Agilities kind of got incredibly bodied by Blase on Doom. Like before this, I would say that Agilities has looked okay, but he just got melted absolutely by Blase. If there's a person I really am looking to, it's Nevix. Nevix has had a pretty significantly consistent performance throughout this entire season so far. Against, you know, Houston, it wasn't that great, but he's always been kind of this rock type of player. And if we get a little bit more out of Nevix, I think this team is going to be a lot better, because I think he's one of the shining spots along with Surefour.
Well, moving down from Canada, moving instead into the south of the USA, we got to talk about the debut of the Atlanta Reign. All of us, pretty much, except for, well, Lafon, you were trolling with your predictions.
All of us.
But all of us,
oh, no.
Realistically speaking, expected this team to come out swinging, and they did, admittedly, against the Toronto Defiant, but it wasn't a perfect weekend for them, Lafon.
No, and I think this is, you know, I did say yes the last time we were on the show last week that it would be an 0-2 weekend for them. I was being a little bit spicy. I didn't actually believe it would be an 0-2. In fact, I thought it would be a 2-0 in actuality. What ends up happening is a 1-1. Yeah, obviously I'm not going to walk back to my prediction, but it ends up being a 1-1. And I think there's a bigger question to be asked here, and that's, what is the real playstyle that Atlanta Reign is coming through with? Because they started off with a double main tank, right, with Gator and Pokebo, in the Rein Orisa, Pokebo playing the Reinhardt, and then they end the weekend with Hawk on, the D.Va, and this is where they ended up losing to Paris. This is a question I have for Atlanta: is their first 2 games, let's not sell them too high, but let's also not sell them too short, considering the Scrimbucks exchange. I think Atlanta hasn't really proven that they've got a consistent play style. Maybe they get a little cocky, and that ends up costing them. But against Toronto, they look strong. Afterwards, not so much.
I think with specifically Gator and Pokpo, though, coming into this matchup, I think that might have been a targeted thing specifically at Toronto, because Toronto, as we know, runs a lot of this dive composition, and you don't want to run dive into, Orisa Reinhardt. That's probably not the ideal situation there, especially when Baby Bay, as we'll talk about a little bit later, was playing, what he was playing on that Torbjorn. But I think that was a specifically thing targeted at Toronto, whereas I think what they played against Paris is what they actually want to play, and that's a little bit more concerning.
Well, let's jump to Baby Bay real quick here, because there was no signs of Sharp or Edison, the 2 other DPS players we can potentially expect to kind of slot into the roster in that same position. And he came out on the Torb, Lafon.
And I mean, he
paying homage to Fran.
To Fran. Yeah, there was a post-game interview, with the press conference with Baby Bay, and he sort of mentioned how it all started. Right, it was literally in scrims. He wanted to tilt a team that was doing poorly, picked the Torbjorn, and they found out, hey, it's actually doing pretty well. What with the Overload and the Molten Core. So, and of course the turret. So he, it started off as sort of a cheese pick that was designed specifically to tilt a team. I believe they mentioned Houston Outlaws being that team. And, everyone, you gotta rag on the team when they're down sometimes. But I think, they found it turned out really well. And so they kept playing. And I think for Baby, it could be just as simple as that.
Well, let's talk about his DPS counterpart, though, Kenobi, because I know you can go on and on about quote unquote Zerster, as you like to call him, but Erster, as he's known here in the Overwatch League. He was phenomenal this weekend, even in their loss.
Yeah, even in their loss. I mean, their one win, Paul, I would say, is solely on the back of Erster, as we saw in that Hanamura. That last push where they got it all the way to the end, that was him using the Blizzard to stop the Deadeye, and then they went in and they took the point after that. Erster, his walls have been phenomenal, just the way he's been playing at such a high level, and we have it written in our notes here that he's smurfing an owl, and I think that's totally apt. This is a DPS all-star MVP caliber level player at the moment, and it's interesting that they're not pairing him up with someone like a Sharp or like an Edison just yet. I want to see what that type of DPS duo would look like, where you have 2 star carry potential players at your DPS role.
Well, and something we threw around while we were talking about this weekend was Erster potentially being the best flex DPS in the Overwatch League, at least that we've seen this season, right? Is there anyone who, either of you, I'll start with you, Lafon, anyone that we've seen thus far, or maybe that we even haven't seen, that you think can contend with that title?
And I think I have the bias of having watched Erster in Chinese Contender, so I know a little bit about what he can bring to the table, and the answer is quite a bit. I think when we're really talking about it, the players that come to mind ahead of Erster are like Prophet, right? When we're talking about that level of maximum flexibility at the highest level, Prophet really only comes to mind. I think Erster, if he's given the reign, if he's given the room, the pun intended, I apologize, but if he's given the room to kind of work with, he could just be one of the best DPS players in the world in Overwatch. I strongly believe that. And I really don't think, aside from Prophet, who has shown since the Apex days that he's capable of, absolutely mastering a character the second he picks it up, I don't think there's anyone else out there who really rivals Erster.
I think I agree with what LaFon says. I also have the advantage of having seen Erster a while back, played what he played in Chinese Contenders, and this guy isn't just a Mei player, right? We saw this even last year. He can play a lot. He was even playing Tracer on some of these Hanamura defenses.
Famous, just 4K pulse bomb from last year.
The 4K pulse bomb, then the 6K to follow it up. On Hanamura, you saw him running around on Tracer at the end, just one-clipping people, getting 3Ks and stuff like that. This guy can carry your team, as we saw, and I think LaFon is totally right that we have to start discussing him as being one of the best DPS in Overwatch League, and maybe one of the best flex supports in the league right now as well.
Flex DPS, not flex supports. He's not making that transition like Architect as of yet. But let's talk about a team rather than just a player whose stonks are on the rise. I hate saying the word stonks out loud.
It rolls off the tongue so well, though, like stonks. Yeah.
But the Paris Eternal had a phenomenal weekend, honestly. They beat Atlanta Reign pretty solidly outside of that one Hanamura map that Erster did pretty much carry on. Kenobi, Hanbin is phenomenal. He's a star coming in, this rookie.
he just makes this team so much better than they were previously. And they have that one map loss, but it is to Toronto. Before they had Hanbin, and now they have Hanbin here. Hanbin is a complete star. He's everywhere on the McCree, doing damage, flanking around for the enemy team, peeling for his team. It seems like everywhere Hanbin needs to be at once, he's there. And if we go to this nerf where the PTR patches come in and we do get to a point where it is 3 seconds to 4 seconds on boosters, that's a nerf to Hanbin. That's the Hanbin nerf, because right now he's using these boosters to maximum potential, and he is a star in the making on this team, on a team that has a lot of upcoming stars from that old Element Mystic roster.
Well, and another one, speaking of Element Mystic, Exy, right? He came out dominating on the McCree this weekend against Baby Bay, who we expect to be a very solid McCree player, Lafon.
I mean, Exy has proven that he's going to be capable of being a star player in this league for a very long time to come, and it shows in just the highlights that comes up whenever he's on screen. I think he's had his moments where he's looked a little bit shaky, whether that's because of the compositions that are kind of played around him. We saw obviously against Toronto Defiant, it was a double, the weird tank setup that he was kind of playing against that kind of struggled. But I think Exy is going to be a star for a very long time in the Overwatch League, and honestly, the stats prove it.
Certainly, but the Element Mystic players are not the only ones who are stars on the Paris Eternal. The French also coming out, representing their home country well.
Yeah, FD God specifically is the person who I would target here. You saw memorable plays, that one play where he boops the Hammond off the point to win them that one on Busan. That was really clutch coming out from him. And I think that you mentioned the French players. I think the coolest thing about Paris is how they've kind of acclimated with each other, right? We thought that there might be some communication issues, but it looks very good. And FD God, for instance, helps a lot in Paris in playing this kind of aggressive style where Paris is just like, all right, hit the speed, hit the go button, amp it up, we're going in. And I think FD God plays really well into that team that way. Speaking
of the French, and you also said targeting FD God, you can't catch him. But speaking of the French, Ben Best is coming into play as well. And I think he's much improved from last year. I don't have a ton of notes on him specifically because, at the very beginning of the season, I was very low on Ben Best, but ultimately he's kind of proven me wrong. And that's really all you can ask for.
I love to see Ben Best rocking in on that Reinhardt. I think he's doing a great job. But I think that more or less sums up the highlights from our review of the Houston homestand. Congrats again to Houston with their not 0-6 start. Now we have to look toward the future. We have to look toward the upcoming Washington homestand, the return to Washington. We were just there a week ago. But before we get into the matches, let's get into the hero bands specifically and what we have working in the hero pool. Now, the eliminated heroes for this week were, in order of them being picked, Reinhardt, Moira, McCree, and then Widowmaker. The double hit scans there. But let's start on the tanks and supports. Lafon, I'm going to throw it to you. Reinhardt, big deal. Moira, maybe not so much.
I think Moira was one of those things, and this is going to be a little bit of a theme, but she squeaked in at the very end of the time there. A very low relative pick rate compared to her brethren in Ana and Lucio, but ends up being taken out. I don't think this makes a big deal as of the Reinhardt Diva setup, but it might make a difference when we get to the main tank, because Reinhardt was banned, and the next possible one that comes in is we kind of think, is it going to be the dive targets come in, right? The Winston Diva, or are we going to see Orisa make a return? And this is where I think there's been some argument and some discussion. Some people are very much in the camp that there's going to be Orisa gameplay. Some are going to be in the camp that Dive is going to make a return. Obviously, when we get to the DPS, you highlighted a little bit. It'll play to that as well. But I think here with the Moira, you're not going to have the Orisa nearly as much, I think, simply because you can't play that kind of double shield comp we were kind of used to in a couple of patches ago. I think these tanks are kind of, I don't want to say the tank of the sport. I don't want to say are irrelevant bans because they were played. It's Reinhardt specifically. I think this is going to be one of the case of we're not really sure what the meta the setup is going to be coming into these next games this week, because the tanks aren't going to be dictating it for the first time in a very long time, and that's actually a bit of a surprise to me.
Well, and it's worth saying that a lot of what we see in this first ever week with the hero pools implemented is going to depend not only on teams, what they're comfortable with playing, but also on maps we go to, right? We're not going to say the same, or we're not going to see the same thing on, Village in Nepal as we might on Sanctuary of Busan.
For sure. And
Well, let's move on to the DPS, unless Kenobi, you have something
no,
to talk.
I was going to talk about the
No?
DPS. That's exactly where I was going.
Well, then perfect. Let's talk about him because much to everyone's dismay, I didn't even mean to do that one. That was not even intended.
On.
Myself
Get some fail fishes in the chat, please. Oh.
Keep them coming. I am nourished by the hatred of puns. But McCree and Widowmaker, double hit scan banned this week. Could see some Pharah. Might see some increased dive, considering that McCree will not be around anymore. What are our thoughts on this?
I think we can definitely see this is actually like a hit scan's worst nightmare at the moment, because now you're somewhat forced to lock the legs.
Poor Saya player.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he got banned out really hard. He's not even playing though, so what does it even matter? But I mean, like, for instance, like Soldier, I think can come back into the meta a little bit. Diva is still a thing, so that makes it a little bit kind of wonky. But if we are going to see things like Pharah, you're going to need something to deal with it. And right now, since we don't have McCree and Widowmaker, your best bet's probably Soldier. Ashe isn't even a character at the moment, so possibility there. I think for teams that rely a lot on the Widowmaker and McCree, specifically Washington, right? I think they might start running something like Tracer Pharah, where you sub in Tuba, you put Corey on Tracer, very serviceable Tracer himself, and then you can play around that. But McCree not being here, I think, allows a little bit more into it being dive, because McCree has always kind of been that anti-dive hero. You know, I'm going to throw it all the way back to Miraculous Youngster, who kind of innovated anti-dive. McCree was like the biggest part of that. So I think without McCree and without the ability to flashbang, I think that opens up a lot of heroes as well. Like Reaper can be opened up to that. Doom can also be opened up to that. So just taking out McCree, you're really just taking out the CC and the flashbang and stuff like that. So possibilities for different types of compositions, death ball, dive, whatever. I'm not sure exactly where we're going to go though.
What if I say this composition, you just tell me, I'm just going to pick your brain real quick.
Okay.
Risa, Diva, Brig, Ana, Reaper, May.
Yeah, you're not diving onto that. Yeah, you don't dive onto that.
I'm just saying that's
fun. You've spoken that into existence, and now when we see that,
that's going to be really.
I'm going to blame you. I'm going to blame you specifically.
That is like Mr. X. He's the one who didn't ban May, not me.
That is true. That is true. But to Lafon's point, before we just go forward, like, that is the comp that I want to see the absolute least. Like, switch like Brig for maybe like BAP, and then it's just like, no, I don't.
And switch Diva for Sigma, and then, you know.
And then we're back to whatever we were before this. And
nobody wants to go back to double shield.
Let's move forward, because I don't want to hear about this.
Let's keep our eyes on the future instead. Let's talk about the upcoming weekend at the Washington homestand and a couple of the notable matches itself. First off, we have the battle for the top of the Atlantic Conference again.
We have
Philly just keeps walking up and like putting other teams in their place anytime we think that someone is going to contest them for number one in the Atlantic. Kenobi, do we think that Philly is going to keep on that train, or Paris on the rise? Maybe give them a run for their money.
I think they can give them a run for their money. I think like 1 or 2 maps is definitely possible for Paris. I think they're incredibly talented. I think this kind of battle for the top of the Atlantic Conference will come into play a little bit more when we see Fusion play Atlanta. I think that's like the big one. This is more of like, how legitimate is Paris in terms of a contender? Like, are they going to be able...
Paris beat Atlanta though.
Paris beat Atlanta. I know, but like, you know, transitive property. Did I say Paris versus Atlanta, or did I say Fusion versus Atlanta?
You said Fusion versus Atlanta.
Okay, good. But yeah, but transitive property, you know, haha. But I think in terms of with Fusion and Paris, I would give Paris 1 map and then a second map if like XEI is able to beat Carpe in like in a McCree battle. No, we can't even have that. So no. So everything that I just said.
Yeah, we actually can't.
We can't have that. So that's the thing with the hero pools. It just doesn't matter anymore. So like, what are they even going to play? I have to think about this a little bit more. But I just all in all, generally, Fusion probably gets the advantage.
We agree with that, Lafon?
I mean, don't look now. Fusion are undefeated, and they just keep looking better. Got to give the advantage to the Philly Fusion.
They've already beat over half their competition in the Atlantic Conference. Let's talk about a couple others of these Atlantic teams. Not so much toward the top of the ladder.
Do we have to?
But a little bit closer to the bottom. Not necessarily rock bottom. We called this topic the wood tier promotions out of a bit of levity here. It's Toronto Defiant versus the Florida Mayhem. Lafon, I think it's safe to say that the losers of this match should probably go to Twitter and add in their bio pro Valorant player.
Yeah, Overwatch has not been kind to these players this season
Not so much.
for sure. On a serious note, though, there is talent on the squads, and I think consistency has been the biggest issue for them. It's not that they're bad. I think there's some great players. It's realistically, I mean, Yaki at the very start was really strong, tapered off towards the end. Toronto Defiant, we talked up Surefour, but logics and agilities are nowhere to be found. And I think, across the board, there's players that have looked good and then not so good. And I think for these teams, I need to see consistency before I'm willing to give any sort of a confidence to either squad.
Well, an inconsistency, you brought up the DPS. Kenobi, let's dive into that because I think Surefour is really the only person on either roster when it comes to DPS where we've seen them this season, and we're confident that they can consistently output a high level of play.
Right, because Surefour had that one matchup against Fusion where he was going up against Carpe, was winning that pretty, I mean, not winning that, but he went toe-to-toe at least with him there, and I haven't really seen that from anyone else. Like Yaki, like Lafon mentions, incredibly inconsistent on, at least the last weekend. He really didn't play up to the standards that I've known him for when he was on Runaway and stuff like that. And then like Logix also, he's coming in for control maps and then leaving, and looking all right. They won the one map where Logix was in, and I just have to ask, what is the deal with them? We talked about that a little bit earlier, but yeah, the DPS of this team, little bit lacking in terms of just consistency besides Surefour, like we said.
Well, speaking of things that are lacking, this weekend, honestly, a little bit lackluster. These aren't the hard bangers of matches, the fiery, spicy contestations, realistically speaking, going into this weekend. We've got matches like Paris versus Houston. Don't expect that to be close. We round it out with Atlanta versus Boston, as if Boston will get a map. Is there anything we can at least look forward to other than the two matches we've already kind of prefaced?
I mean, maybe NYXL and Justice would be the one that I'm like looking towards. NYXL is an interesting team with how they're going to be playing. Are we going to see Sabiobi and Who Are You back in the lineup? Are they going to play Dive, right? Is Sabiobi going to be on Reaper and they're going to put Who Are You back on May? I would love to just see, Sabiobi on Reaper, Libera on May. That's what I want to see, but I don't think we're going to get that because the coaching team hates me. So I don't know. And
you specifically, obviously.
Yeah, me specifically, because I really want to see more Libero. But for the Justice side, Lafon, I'm not sure what they're going to run. Corey is their star player, and he's banned out.
Well, banned out's a bit of an overstatement. I think Corey has been known to play Tracer, Hanzo. He can play a wealth of heroes. Reaper, actually, he was pretty good at too. So I think there is room for him to sort of explore. But yeah, this is going to be a tough game. I think this weekend as a whole is going to be tough to watch if you're a fan of, or if you're not a fan of either of the teams playing. This is one of those times where I'd say if you're a fan of a team playing, watch their game. If not, perhaps look for a couple of the spicy stories. But otherwise, I don't really see a lot to write home about in terms of games being played out this weekend.
Well, we're going to write home about this episode of The Control Point real quick. But first, we've got to go to overtime. It's going to be a very quick overtime as we're running a little bit behind today. So we just got to get this fired off. Let's get it rolling. Kenobi, first up, new North America and Europe contenders casting talent. A lot of familiar faces, a lot of people moving on up.
Yeah, a lot of new pairs as well, and I'm very excited to see. Very happy for Lemon and Hurix who are moving on up. We know them very well. Shout outs to them, and I think it's a great talent lineup. We're going to see a lot of good games and good casts.
Speaking of contenders, Lafon, the hero pool has been announced as the same for Overwatch League. They will consistently be following one another throughout the seasons. How do we feel about that change for the competitive integrity, as you like to call it, of contenders?
2 points. One, it's good. Contenders should follow Overwatch League's schedule a little bit more. I like it. The second thing is, though, the first week may actually not be played on the hero pool for certain regions. That's a bit of a question mark, but other than that, I think it's totally okay.
Kenobi, we saw a lot of interesting signs at the Houston homestand. Any stand out to you as ones you liked or maybe particularly didn't?
Someone had the General Kenobi sign, so that's my favorite right there. But someone needs to vet those signs before they get onto screen. There were some ones that are not the greatest.
Speaking of decisions that need to be vetted, Lafon, sticking with Houston, Jake's jersey was retired this week. There's been a lot of different thoughts on this decision. What's your take?
Not great. Nothing against Jake. He's a lovely person. His cast has been fantastic this season, but he played for 2 seasons, and he didn't even have the same number between the 2 seasons. Retirement, not in order, in my opinion.
All right, Kenobi, Munchkin dropped by the Boston Uprising, but picked up by Contenders team or Contenders Trials team. Lucky Future, you're familiar with the brand at least. How do we feel about this move?
Lucky Future is truly becoming the retirement home for Overwatch League players.
Oh boy. All right, quick one-liner with that one. Lafon, Jexay on Twitter, Raucus outed him as such a wholesome lad. It warms my heart, Lafon.
Yeah, and then, Abe God kind of put him back in his place. It's a little bit funny, but that back and forth is something I live for.
Threw him under the bus a bit. Speaking of people throwing others under the bus, Funny Astro and Poco not too happy with their match against Boston this week.
Yeah, I mean, you flew 4 hours to get to 3-0, and that game took probably like an hour. Like, I hope they were flying, some nice, like, first class or something like that. Coach is not something I want to be flying that for.
Well, let's move on to the hometown for next weekend. It's going to be Washington. They've swapped the start time for their match on Sunday, Lafon. Instead of being the last match of the day starting at 7 p.m. Eastern, you didn't put it in the script. It's going to be at 5 p.m. It's going to be the second match of the day so that the younger fans can go to bed for school.
Congratulations. You figured out Washington is in the East indeed, but it's a cute move. And you know what? Good for them. Good to see more players or more people interested, especially the young crowd, in the games.
All right. Speaking of the games, Washington hosts their second homestand. We already talked a little bit about who they play, but instead, I want to ask you both a question. We'll start with you, Kenobi. Do we see the return of the acrobats, the aerialists, the Cirque du Soleil?
If they want to win, no. They have cursed them that last weekend. You cannot bring them back if you want to at least win one game this weekend.
Lafon, what performance can they have instead?
Oh boy.
Quick.
You know what? Corey walking up on stage and dancing. That'd be funny.
That would be better than, that
would be pretty good.
I'd like to see that. I'd pay to see that. And a lot of people are going to pay, maybe not to see that. We'll see what Washington has in store, but that'll be it for this week on The Control Point. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Make sure, if you like this show, you can follow us on Elohel Esports. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel. And if you're watching live on Twitch, there's a follow button on your screen right now. We'll be back next week discussing the second Washington homestand and how it went. If you're with us on Twitch, stick around. We'll have a Q&A, just laid back with the chat afterwards. And if you're not, you're watching on YouTube, maybe tune in next week at 8 p.m. Eastern time. That'll be it, though. For myself, Paulsible, Kenobi, and Lafon, we'll see you next week on The Control Point.